All right, everybody, welcome today to our CRAN session this afternoon. This webinar today is focused on the process of designing for zero net energy uh, buildings and missions. It covers both the planetary health benefits and human health benefits of ZNE design and how designing for this above code goal differs from a typical or conventional processes. Both embodied carbon and operational carbon emissions are going to be discussed today. Our speaker today is Ann Administer, and she is a California-based green building consultant with a national practice, laser focused on decarbonizing homes and communities. She's trained as an architect and facilitates design teams, coaches, and other building practitioners, works on applied research projects, teaches, develops education programs, and rabble rouses in the climate space on her spare time. For more than a quarter century ago, she focused on her master's thesis on embodied carbon, which was a bit ahead of the times back then. And a dozen years ago, she wrote the first book on zero energy homes, somewhat more timely to be sure, but we're still waiting for the times to catch up with ZNE design. Anne, welcome today, and please take it away.
Thank you so much, Jennifer and Veronica, for the setup and introduction. And thanks to attendees today for taking time out of the middle of your day for this. So this is just going to be kind of a whirlwind tour of the world of net zero and some of its permutations and definitions and implications for design practice. So here we go. The obligatory course description, which Jennifer's basically already given you, and learning objectives. So, here's the basic agenda. I'm going to go over 6 topics, sort of the rationale for offering this topic, foundations of net zero design, an overview that's very specific to homes, some thoughts on the design process itself, cost information, and perspectives, I guess, and then some resources for future research and contemplation for you all. Okay, so the rationale, the big why and biggest why, of course, is the planet, but we also have local, state, and federal policies that are driving this direction. And certainly we've got a whole array of health, safety, and resiliency rationales. The little graphic here shows you there are lots of ways of slicing and dicing the energy and building emissions pie, but I think this one does a pretty good job showing the 2 big wedges on the right, red for building operations and green for building materials and construction, together represent almost 40% of overall emissions. So we have a huge opportunity, and I expect this is not really news to all of you, but to just reiterate the kind of top level takeaway for all this. More specifically and more in line with what we're seeing in terms of the development of state policy, now you're probably all hearing the buzz about decarbonization. And what does this mean? So carbon, we use carbon as a shorthand for greenhouse gases and their emissions. And so decarbonization is the idea of getting rid of the things that produce greenhouse gases in the built environment. Preeminent among those is what we refer to as natural gas. It's kind of interesting that we've attached natural to this. There are both natural and synthetic sources of this gas. The main component of which is methane. And methane is a hugely impactful, devastatingly impactful global warming gas. It's 84 times more potent than carbon dioxide in a 20-year time frame. And so we need to pay a lot more attention to than we have in the past. And something that's only been realized, I think, or broadly understood in the last few years, is when you combine the global warming potential of methane with line leakage, it actually makes this fuel as polluting as coal. in broad strokes. So where in decades past, natural gas was promoted as a clean fuel, we now know better. So there are also, of course, risks to occupants in buildings with gas. So we have a lot of reasons why we have to be laser focused on decarbonization. So, and how this is all reflected in the state's policy evolution. This is just I don't expect you to read all the fine print on the screen. It's just to kind of recap some of the major milestones for the state that have been moving towards where we are today. So the first policy specifically addressing the goal of zero net energy was in 2007. And then here we are 14 years later in 2021, we had AB 1010 was passed requiring architects to complete 5 hours of zero net carbon design coursework. So this is the progression from zero net energy. And then as more has been analyzed and understood about what that means for us as a society, the state has recognized we have for a long time used energy as a proxy for carbon emissions, and that not addressing emissions specifically has meant that we've kind of been ignoring the impacts of natural gas for a long time. And the state recognized that it needed to start explicitly addressing emissions by looking at the natural gas part of the equation. So that's just the short version of what's been a very long evolution in state energy and climate policy. Now, getting a little more personal to architects in practice, what we are seeing is that we now have, and this is, last time I checked, this was a couple months ago. At that point, there were 74, minimum of 74 California local jurisdictions that have put one or another type of decarbonization regulations in place. And actually, there's a link here to Sierra Club where they're keeping track of all these jurisdictions. There are a couple of other resources that also show you how this is trending. So what this all means, of course, and oh, and by the way, I think this is now represents about 20 to 25% of the state's population. So it's a very big deal, and it is not surprisingly concentrated in the more developed coastal regions as opposed to the more rural areas. So this means that very soon you're likely to have a client who might ask for a zero net carbon project or an all electric project or to help decarbonize their existing home. Or as I mentioned, your town might insist upon it. So, and then of course, again, we had Title 24, 2022 that went into effect a few months ago, very specifically encouraging building decarbonization, emphasizing the use of heat pumps, and with the big picture goal of enabling our buildings to be more responsive to climate change. So we're not at net zero or zero net carbon, pick your term, but it's very clear that that is the direction we're heading. And certainly there's a lot of speculation that the next iteration of Title 24 may in fact be zero net emissions, zero net carbon. Again, there's a lot of terminology. I'll be going into some of that. Before that level of detail, though, I just want to point out a bit more specifically what this means in terms of the current energy code, the 2022 code, and what it means by encouraging electrification. So these two graphs here are juxtaposed diagonally, not to be clever visually, but to show the zero on the x-axis is at the same place on both graphs. But on the left, what we see is what happens with homes modeled with 4 gas appliances. And on the right, the upper right, these are homes modeled with all electric appliances. And this is relative to the prescriptive base case, which is 3 gas appliances. And what this shows is that in the scenario with 4 gas appliances on the bottom left, these are not compliant in any climate zone in California by either the TDV or source metric. By contrast, the all electric scenarios are compliant in all climate zones except 15 and 16. So this is a clear illustration visually of what the code is trying to do. So, and in the quote from the cost effectiveness study on the bottom right shows that this means that the gas appliance scenarios will require deep efficiency in order to overcome where the baseline is set. So if you haven't already encountered this challenge in your practice, you may very well be facing it. On the bright side, your clients may be quite interested in this because of all the money that's been put on the table by the feds via the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as what's happening in a lot of local jurisdictions, with more money coming through utilities and community choice aggregators, your CCAs. So there's a lot of money on the table now. This visual is from an example, as this says on the upper right, two-person home with a combined income of 150,000 in New York City. So this scenario is not going to be like every dollar here is available to every potential client. But the point is, there are a lot of goodies out there to be had for going in this direction, far more than have ever been available in the past. So you're definitely seeing a big policy push from many sources. Okay, now moving on to the definitional issues. Start out with the basic concept, which is that as compared to, say, a conventionally designed building that we've been familiar with in past years, past decades, which is the orange, the left-hand scenario, where we have a certain amount of demand created by the building. What we're looking to do is to reduce that demand substantially through efficiency measures, and then to meet that demand of the more efficient building with renewable energy production, typically on site. So that's where all of these definitions start and what they all have in common, whether net zero electricity, net zero energy, and net zero emissions. And we'll look at how do those differ. Really is a function of how much renewable energy we're providing with that building. So you'll see on the left, we've got our three different definitions, three E's, the energy. If renewable energy is supplying 100% of the home's annual energy use, with all fuels considered, whether it's whatever mix of gas and electricity, that would be considered net zero energy. If we're talking about net zero electricity, it means we're providing enough renewable energy only to balance out the electricity usage, again, regardless of whatever the fuel mix in the home might be. And that's fundamentally the basis for the prior version of the energy code. Now we move on to the third definition, net zero emissions. And in this case, what we're looking to do is provide enough renewable energy, I missed a syllable or two there, to offset all the electricity use. And in that case, it would be an all electric home. So it's a home without any natural gas or propane. In addition, that home would be using 100% zero emissions grid power in order to get fully zero net emissions or zero net carbon. Now, for present purposes, often when we talk about a zero net emissions or a zero net carbon building, there tends to be a little bit of kind of ignoring the fact that we're still reliant on the grid, and not all the grid sources are clean at all hours of the day and all hours of the year. So you'll see a lot of sort of shorthand and a relatively imprecise use of these terms, but this will give you the basic framework for what these mean. Okay, coming back to our cornerstone of efficiency that underlies all of these definitions. There are several categories of efficiency that we look at. Efficient form and orientation, which is a favorite of mine, and I would say tends to be the most overlooked, partly because in our energy modeling, which is our major tool that we have for looking at energy performance, both the standard and the proposed design use the same form and orientation. So it's easy to forget the importance of those variables. When we add on a high performance enclosure, which of course our models do look at, as well as super efficient mechanical systems. And I'm, for convenience, lumping in here both HVAC and water heating, and then add in what I call best in class electric devices. Then we are essentially creating a home that is ready to be zero net energy or zero net carbon, so long as it is designed, built, and commissioned to be efficient enough to operate at that level once a renewable energy system is added. I'll just mention a little bit more. I use best in class electric devices because for a long time, Energy Star was sort of used as a proxy for highly efficient electric devices. Energy Star has become so ubiquitous that even the EPA created a new label, which is Energy Star Most Efficient. So Energy Star alone really no longer is sort of the pinnacle of energy performance when it comes to electric devices. Okay, so why do we care so much about efficiency? Certainly, one view of things is, well, you design a building, you put enough solar on it to meet whatever definition, and bada bing, bada boom, there you are at zero net, fill in the blank. However, it is important because there are a lot of benefits that come along with efficiency that we don't necessarily achieve otherwise. With improved comfort, stable temperatures have become a lot more interesting to people once we started experiencing a lot of power outages. We can also get improved wildfire resiliency with the right features when we look at those issues synergistically, efficiency and resiliency. Of course, lower overall energy use and utility bills, also of increasing interest as our utility rates go up. Reduce intrusion of outdoor pollutants. So not only smoke, which again has become much more obvious as a concern throughout the state, but also noise and cooking odors. There are a whole host of pollutants that are of interest, vehicle exhaust near freeways. And of course, we're more and more concerned with that in a world that's become more sensitized to equity issues. I also want to just wrap this page by pointing out that stable temperatures are a life safety feature, not merely a comfort issue when we have power outages in extreme temperature events. And so particularly now, you're all custom residential architects, but perhaps you may also dabble in multifamily design. A lot of multifamily projects for many years in California have omitted air conditioning and may continue to do so because costs are so tight. So it becomes really more and more important to ensure that stable temperature as much as possible is provided by the quality of the enclosure. Okay, and pointing out that again, going all electric, when we compare the relative cost of, say, heating buildings with electricity versus gas, electric rates are higher. We can counteract that influence by making sure that we're extremely efficient. Okay, so we do all that, we do it well, we add a renewable energy system, and there we are at our zero net energy or zero net emissions, electricity, carbon, pick your metric, pick your target. Okay, moving on to foundations. I like to start by talking about embodied carbon because almost all of the conversation for a very long time around getting to zero net, fill in the blank, energy, carbon, emissions has been around operating energy and emissions. But we're starting to understand as our window to address climate change is getting narrower and narrower and more alarming, that embodied carbon is very significant in the short term. So this graph is really more of a conceptual thing than real numbers, but I'm pointing to the second version of the graph from the top, which represents zero net energy new construction, where, in other words, in the big block of time in the middle, the building's operational life, we're achieving zero net operating energy. And so the emissions from that building during the operational period are zeroed out, right? So what's left is the embodied carbon that occurs with the construction of the building, going all the way back to the extraction of raw materials, the various stages of transportation and transformation that make those materials become a building. And then finally, of course, there's also end of life embodied carbon impacts. But what this shows is that in a highly efficient, newly built, newly designed building, that, call it a 8 to 10 year period leading up to the beginning of operations, can actually dwarf the emissions from that short period of time, can actually dwarf the emissions over the operating life of the building. And so what this means is we have a real obligation to pay attention to both. And in fact, to me, this means we shouldn't be building anything that's absolutely necessary. I'm not trying to put everybody out of work. That's not going to happen. But we should be looking more and more to the reuse of buildings, the reuse of materials, and really being as frugal as possible with materials and as, I guess, savvy as possible about material choices. So there is a whole palette of materials. Architecture 2030 has put together this materials palette I would highly encourage you to look at. And so we won't go into that in depth today, but to just sort of really try and emphasize the importance of both parts of this equation. So fuels and materials both matter, while the rest of this talk is about eliminating fossil fuels to achieve zero operating emissions. I do want to encourage ongoing education about the impact of material choices on embodied emissions and the really challenging task of striving to achieve zero embodied emissions. And my final note on this slide, this matters in particular in the zero net carbon or zero net emissions equation, because we go back to the notion of efficiency. Solar panels are among our highest embodied carbon materials that we work with. So we really want to do everything we can to minimize the amount of solar we need to meet those zero operating emissions goals. Okay, so what do we mean with this zero? We're leaving behind now embodied emissions, and we're moving on to the primary topic today of zero operating emissions. So we're talking all electric buildings. We've got the big four in homes, which is, again, the primary interest of your group, I know. And in commercial buildings, it's a very parallel conversation, but obviously based on building type and the specific uses in the building, that can get quite a bit more complex. So, I've got my little animations out of order here. We'll just bring them all on here. So going all electric means we're eliminating on-site explosion risks. That's pretty awesome. We've got improved equipment because this is going to be new stuff. It's going to be our most high efficiency stuff. We're helping to avoid those gas price increases, which I already mentioned, which are expected to nearly double in a couple more decades. We're also reducing kitchen safety risks and the indoor air pollution that goes along with those, as well as hitting of course, the climate goals, which I'll be saying a little bit more about too. So gas cooking hazards. This is another topic that has really been eye-opening, I would say, over the last couple of years, as we're learning more and more that it's really pretty darn terrible for human health to be cooking with gas in our homes, or commercial kitchens for that matter. So these are a couple of excerpts from a Rocky Mountain Institute report, this in the next slide, showing how we're exceeding safe levels of pollutants in our homes when we cook with gas. And this is particularly damaging, of course, to children whose immune systems are still developing, and of course to the elderly as well, or anyone else who may be health or immune compromised. So we've got lots and lots of adverse effects that may come from this gas cooking. And again, not to be alarmist, but the more I know about this, the more happy I am that I transitioned to induction cooking when I moved to a new home 4 years ago. And the more I tend to proselytize friends, relatives, and certainly clients about the joys of switching away from gas cooking. So I'll give an overview now of what does this mean? What are the choices we're making in home designs? I mentioned the big four. Here they're all again: space conditioning, water heating, clothes drying, cooking. And I've got a few more beyond the big four. And this is again 30,000 foot view, not a lot of details. I'm just trying to provide a quick snapshot of the choices. So for space heating, there's either standard heat pump, which I'm showing on the right, or mini split heat pump on the left. The great advantage of the mini splits, they can be either ducted or ductless when a home is efficient enough or small enough for a mini split to meet those loads. It is by far the most efficient choice. A standard heat pump is also quite a lot more efficient than other forms of heating, is always ducted, and is going to be the option of choice in larger or less efficient homes. Now, with new construction, obviously, we're always trying for very efficient. And I have colleagues who have built homes in California's more extreme climates, for example, up by Mount Shasta or in Redding, where the heating loads and cooling loads are actually pretty close to those of Chicago. And they have managed to design new homes upwards of 3,000 square feet and met those loads with a single 3/4 ton mini split. So it can be done. In retrofit situations, it's going to be hard to get an existing home to achieve that level of efficiency. So if you're engaged on a remodeling project, you might not be able to quite get there with a mini split. And there are also certainly spatial configurations that could make mini splits a little bit more challenging, where a standard heat pump is going to work better for you. Electric water heating. I'm sure you're all familiar with tankless units, and there are very efficient tankless units. They are approaching 100% efficiency. However, heat pump water heaters, which I'm showing on the left, are about 3 times as efficient as the most tankless unit. And you might think, well, wait a minute, how can something be 3 times more efficient than something that's almost 100% efficient? This comes from the magic of heat pump technologies. Just like a refrigerator, the heat pump is exchanging heat with the surrounding environment. So it isn't making heat, it's borrowing heat from adjoining space. What this means for a heat pump is it needs more space around it than a conventional tank water heater that you're familiar with. It's also going to be a little bit slower to heat the water, so often a larger capacity might be recommended than if you were using a conventional tank unit. There are lots of incentives. This says available from some utilities, but again, we've now got federal incentives for heat pump units, and in many cases, you can actually layer incentives for your clients. So they might get one from utility, from a CCA, and from the federal government. So these are both options for an all-electric home, but clearly from efficiency perspective and in terms of what's being incentivized, a heat pump water heater is where I would go first, unless there's really a problematic situation that makes the large unit a little bit harder to accommodate. There are also there's one model of split heat pump water heater, that's the Sandon. And what that has is the compressor unit lives outdoors, and then the tank portion lives indoors, or it can be in a garage. So if there's and that's by far the most efficient, and also has the lowest global warming potential of any of the refrigerants used in the heat pumps that facilitate the heat exchange. So several options to keep in mind here. Now, for electric cooking, obviously, many folks have cooked with electricity for years and years and years. A lot of those people don't like electric stoves and may rebel at the notion of electric cooking. I like to point out that even gas stoves plug into the wall. So electricity really isn't the central issue. It's about the cooking technology itself. And what's different about induction is it uses a magnetic technology as opposed to the radiant technology that's used by older fashioned electric stoves. It's a very, very different experience. Induction ranges are much more responsive, they're quicker, they're cleaner, they're safer, they offer much better control, and they offer a cooler kitchen experience. So that's particularly important, of course, in a commercial cooking environment, but in hotter climates, it's also definitely a bonus for residential. I do mention the learning curve because what people most complain about is, oh my God, I didn't realize it was so fast. I burned the first meal I cooked on it. So forewarned is forearmed and all that. There's also sometimes people concerned about, oh, I have to switch all my cookware. In many kitchens, most of the cookware is already steel or iron based and does not need to be switched out. So yes, there will be cases where people have to buy new cookware. Honestly, if you're buying a new range, the cost of a cookware added a set, a nice, say, stainless steel cookware set added on top of that does not add substantially. It might add 10%, 5% even to the cost already being paid for the range. Okay, clothes dryer. Number 4, let's not forget solar clothes drying is an option in many cases, not to be overlooked in a more climate sensitive mindset than we may have had in the past. Once again, we have conventional electric dryer as an option, nothing unfamiliar about that. Once again, there's a heat pump option that is advantageous in many ways. It uses lower heat, kinder to the clothes, doesn't require venting, and of course is more efficient. On the less attractive side, it is a longer drying time. So if that matters to people, one possibility might be considered are combination washer dryers, where you put the load in, everything takes place inside the same box. And so that can really alleviate concerns about a longer drying time. If you can put everything in and then leave it, walk away, come back at the end of the day, and it's all done. All right, so that covers the big 4. However, there are a couple of other things that are issues in some homes. Certainly, a lot of people are very attached to the idea of a fireplace. So it's worth looking at alternatives. My favorite is the alternative on the right, which is an outdoor unit. Even something as small as a chimenea can really satisfy that sort of visceral attraction that we have as human beings to fire that comes from way back in human evolution. It's a magnetic, not like the magnetic stove, but we are magnetically attracted to fire. On the other hand, if you want to have an indoor, what do they call them, fire appliance, there are lots of electric models now, some of which even do produce some heat and are visually a lot more convincing than their counterparts of earlier times. I particularly like this one resource, Modern Blaze. It's a retail outlet. I believe they are based in Oregon and have a ton of models available of electric units. A little bit trickier, or really potentially a lot trickier depending on the climate and the client needs or desires for use of a pool, is pool and spa heating. So heat pumps are, once again, a really attractive option because they can run off photovoltaics and are highly efficient. On the other hand, there is not yet a lot of experience out there in the pool heating or HVAC community on getting those systems designed and set up properly. Now, If the clients are only going to use the pools in summer, that's great. Solar thermal will probably work just fine. But if they're interested in more year-round usage, or they're in a climate where there are significant temperature swings, then solar thermal may not be adequate. So my big takeaway here is look for an engineer who has experience designing heat pump heating specifically for pools, if that is the direction that your clients are interested in going, because not everybody out there who may talk a good game about this actually has a lot of experience making it work. So a couple of resources here. They're a little bit dated, but there's some good information in the gray resource box. By the way, the resources here that are in the gray resource boxes or that show up as URLs, these are all clickable hot links in this deck, which I'm assuming that our friends at CRAN will distribute to participants after the presentation. Okay, moving on to design process. We'll run through this a little bit more quickly. Last two sections are very short, so this one's a little bit longer, but I'm gonna kind of zoom. So what's different about designing a ZNC home? As you now get the idea, certainly it's gonna be more efficient than most. Couple of high points to focus on here are air sealing and insulating effectively. That sounds like, oh, of course, but actually our workforce is still not very capable in the air sealing department, particularly. And I'm still not seeing terrific execution on insulation either in the field. So that's something to focus on. I mentioned have nature help, not hinder performance. A couple thoughts about that as we clip through some of these other slides. Having enough solar to meet the annual loads, contiguous roof space is key there. High performance HVAC, a couple things that are important pre-designing the whole system, including where is it all going to go and get to where it needs to be, understanding whatever requirements the equipment may need that is different from what you may be used to, and accommodating all parts of the system in conditioned space. Similarly, for high performance domestic hot water, once again, the entire system ideally would be designed. So now doing all that on budget means thinking ahead. So for working with the end in mind, we want to keep the PV cost as low as possible for, again, both cost and embodied carbon reasons. We want to have very low energy loads. That means we want to simplify. And I'll say more about that. We want high performance enclosure. We've already covered that, as well as the high performance systems. These last 2 points are the more obvious ones, so I spend less time on those. Now, steps. We need solid commitment. We want to make sure there's good understanding with the owner or the client, as well as other key players that are important to full execution of the design as you intended. I really encourage you to pick your solution providers that should have comparable experience. And again, setting expectations across the whole ecosystem of people who are involved in the project, the client solution providers. And that means part of your job is really staying on top of communications across all the main players, all the way through to certificate of occupancy. What I'm looking for when I work on these teams is 4 traits. I want total commitment to the goals. I want creativity, people who aren't going to be sort of stuck in a rut of how they always do things, because that's not how we achieve a higher performance than we've achieved in the past. I want experience that's very comparable in nature and scope to what we're trying to achieve. And I want people who play well with others. And engagement is my shorthand for that. I can kind of remember this mnemonic of 2 C's and 2 E's: commitment, creativity, experience, and engagement. So once I have those people on my team, I'm make sure everybody's really clear on scope. And 2 things in particular: we're not just looking at the big 4 electric, We want to know everything that's in their electric future. Are they planning on EVs? Do they already have EVs? Do they want a battery? Are they going to have an enormous fish tank? Are they going to have freezers to do a lot of canning? We want to know all that. Do they want to address embodied carbon? So then as we move into design, thinking about material choices and design strategies together, because design can matter as much or more than the material choices. And there's a real interplay between these two. You're all architects, you know this, but it becomes even more important, for example, when you do layer in concerns about embodied carbon. And tracking both of them throughout the design process, I think, is hugely important. Where we start, this is one approach that you can use to sort of at least kind of get yourself on a pathway. Set a target energy use intensity. And here's an example in looking at climate zone 3. This is taken from a research report done for the state about 10 years ago. These numbers are still pretty valid. To achieve their net energy, a good EUI in climate zone 3 is 12.7. Where do we go with that? We use that to estimate the annual energy load. So we're going to take that EUI and multiply by house size. In this example, 1,800 square feet in Oakland. We'd come up with almost 23,000 kBTU per year. We convert that to kilowatt hours, and we come up with, okay, our load's going to be, let's call it 6,700 kilowatt hours per year. All right, so what does that mean in terms of PV? Again, we have some rules of thumb we can work with to calculate that. What does 1 kilowatt of DC capacity produce? We use that number divided by the total, and what we find out is we're going to want about 4.1 kilowatts. And what does that mean in terms of area? It's just under 300 square feet, which is approximately 12 solar panels. Okay, here we see a 12 panel array looking at the typical panel size. Again, these are all rough calculations. We say, okay, that could be an array that's 11 feet high, 20 feet wide. But of course, we need more roof than that because there's fire clearance. If we use, in this particular calculation, I said, okay, well, that clearance is going to vary based on the jurisdiction. But if we say 3 feet on 3 sides, in this particular case, that means we need 364 square feet, not just the 220 that would be indicated by the array size. And that's without obstructions. So it's going to take some effort to make sure we have the right amount of space. This leads me to a conversation about simplifying. Complex forms are much harder to heat, insulate, and air seal than simpler forms. They're also harder to fit PV on. Here's an example of a project that I worked on for a university a number of years ago, where they were building housing across the street from an existing neighborhood. So on the lower side is the existing, upper, the new designs. And they were charged with meeting a compatible design aesthetic. Well, if you looked at the elevations, the street elevations, they did a lovely job. But when I sat down with the team and said, let's look at the roof plans. What do you see here? And they were kind of like, I don't know. Well, what do you see? You see a lot more roof planes. You see a lot more corners. So all of those things represent costs and risks and liability. So I thought, well, what is that cost? Just purely number terms. I said, all right, this is a number of years ago, so I'm sure these numbers are out of date. But what I did is I said, okay, let's say we've got a 2,500 square foot plan, and we have our basic rectangle. We've got a slightly elaborated rectangle in option B, and then a more elaborated one in option C. And so what that added for plan A was 200 more feet of, 20 feet more of perimeter, four more corners for Plan B. Sorry, my brain's bouncing around. Plan C has even more perimeter. We've increased our perimeter now by 25%. We're up from 4 to 18 corners. And I said, okay, let's say each foot of perimeter costs 300 feet more, each corner costs 500 feet more to build. That's ignoring a lot of other stuff, right? We're ignoring interiors, roofing, the design cost, occupant utilities, and still we're seeing substantial increases from the cost of complexity. So that matters. All that money can be put into performance things. So as we make our performance choices, for example, by looking at different equipment efficiencies and strategies, it's important to use our energy models to track this progress. So, and you need to make a lot of those trade-offs early on in order to do them cost effectively before you get locked into choices. So I think it's really important to remember that an energy model is most valuable to understand the relative impacts of different options. Predicting actual energy use is not what it's about. And simply checking compliance, which is how it's been used predominantly for decades, that is also not the greatest value. It's certainly important, but we should be using it all along as a tool to really guide design decisions. So this is helpful because it's going to help us understand how efficient is the building, how many solar panels will we need to meet that net zero goal, and how are those going to fit on our design, right? This is what we don't want to happen. So these things need to really be tracked arm in arm as the design proceeds. Okay, looking a little bit more into a few details. Hot water distribution. This is an extremely efficient example in a very affordable home where the designer was actually also the project superintendent. It was a Habitat for Humanity project, and he was phenomenally efficiency minded. And he got this home design down to where the longest hot water pipe was 12 feet long. They had virtually zero loss in heat from the water heater to all of the fixtures. So this obviously is not going to be realistic for most custom residential, but it shows what can be achieved through design when this is a focus. Similarly, same home, super efficient mechanical layout, shows very, very short distribution runs also for all of these spaces, and every bit of the HVAC system was in conditioned space. So again, much more simple example than most of the homes you're likely to be designing, but it shows what the efficiency mindset can do. Few things, notes about glass, kind of a pet thing of mine, holding glass area in check, looking for high performance U factors and solar heat gain coefficients, really with an eye to reducing risks of overheating from solar exposure. So we also need to be thinking about shading and glare protection. I'm a big fan of compression closing units. Anything that slides by definition is pretty leaky. So, and again, you'll see here my favorite point, occupant knees don't enjoy the view. Lots of people love in custom homes floor to ceiling glass. The lower the glass is, the harder it becomes to shade effectively and is absolutely nothing but a heat gain liability. So really want to encourage more attention to shading than I often see in new construction. Some documentation issues that I like to hit. This air sealing document, sample drawing on the right, there's a lot of detail in there. You can't possibly appreciate it all from this slide. It's available as a free download from Coldham Hartman Architects. They're in the Northeast. Obviously, in the Northeast, people have been paying a lot more attention to thermal performance than most parts of California have been for a long time. So there's a lot of valuable information embedded in this document, and I think it's a terrific model. I think specifications are also hugely important and typically not fleshed out to the level they might be in terms of focus on performance and what it takes to achieve performance in the built final product. I think it's also important. I know construction administration is not always part of the scope, but if possible, I really want to encourage that. Your role during construction can be to keep the focus on the goals and on problem solving as a team to ensure that none of the intentions are short circuited by decisions that might be made during construction if you are not part of that process, and to really see things through to commissioning and all verification tasks that will ensure that things operate as they should. So, circling back to where you start with a client, these are some messages that I like to encourage people to share with the client. We're planning for a future without natural gas. What this is going to mean is it's going to make our job much easier if we go towards a simpler, more elegant form, a highly efficient enclosure, making sure that we factor in everything the building systems need for proper performance, and we're providing excellent guidance for the construction team. Now, particularly if you're engaged on a remodeling project where there's already gas on site, as opposed to a new home, you may encounter some resistance to removing gas ranges. So I think it's worth being prepared for this and really encourage clients, if they absolutely will not go down the road of electric cooking, to make sure that all the infrastructure is included that will make electrification later as easy as possible, for whether it's for the current occupant or for later ones. Okay, very quickly on some cost issues. There's always a consideration, oh my God, is this going to cost more? So this is a wonderful publication developed by a bunch of leaders in zero net energy and zero net carbon design, and they've put together a number of case studies. So I've just pulled out a couple with some highlights. These are non-residential examples to just sort of show that these principles can be applied across all building types. This is a building in Silicon Valley that some of you might even be familiar with or have toured. The Indio office building, this is a retrofit. And they did cost more to achieve ZNE, but they've, as you can see, gotten their money back and then some through adopting this strategy. So there are a lot of business arguments that can be made for this in commercial projects. This is a Southern California project, much more complex building as a lab facility. And even in this one, they found that if they ignore the fact that the university required underground parking, that the costs were very commensurate with other buildings of a similar type. This is a research project that was undertaken in Massachusetts as they were looking at some code updates, and they wanted to find out, okay, well, what are the cost implications of moving codes towards zero net energy, zero net carbon? So they looked at several. This is a meta study, and they found very, very nominal cost impacts for multifamily, low and high rise. And here's part of that research as well, where they looked at more building types, and they found the table in the upper right summarizes this nicely. Again, very, very nominal cost increases across building types, or even savings as compared to conventional design. And one of the real standout findings was actual improved life cycle cost improvements across all building types. So to wrap this up, I want to point out that a zero net energy or zero net carbon building isn't really the same product. So it's actually kind of an unfair question to say, oh, but how can I do this because it's going to cost more? Well, A, it doesn't necessarily cost more, but B, it's no longer the same product any more than these two vehicles are the same product. There is a value add in a building that produces much of its own energy and provides other resiliency benefits as compared to the conventional one. So I think messaging around this is hugely important. And wrap up with some resources. This is a very, abbreviated checklist that I can make available to you all via your folks at CRAN. That's just kind of a few high level reminders of things to be thinking of phase by phase. And then here are 8 publications um, that between them have hundreds of other resources within them. And these are all downloadable live documents, PDFs with live links. So this is a terrific resource library to get for yourself and get familiar with what is all embedded in them. For more information across, pretty much every aspect of the topics that I've zoomed through like a fighter pilot today. So thanks so much for your attention.